Kia ora. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me to speak with you all today. Before I start, I just would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from, and that is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I am based in Melbourne, Australia, and lucky enough to live on the land of the traditional owners, and to acknowledge elders past and present, and that this is, always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the Ngā Iwi Māori and the tangata whenua of Aotearoa. And again, it always was, always will be, and always should be Māori land. So again, thank you for inviting me. I have the organisers of this conference, genius programming just then, to have me come after the speakers there, because I am going to share with you, if we go to the first cover slide, please, sort of the fastest 101 you may have ever had on an area of research called implementation science, and how it can really help some of your work in terms of trying to translate and get evidence effectively used. So I'll talk about CI briefly, and then I'll move into that. So as you can see, as in the introduction, we are working in a number of places around the world. We're only about 5 years old, though. We're a not-for-profit research, evaluation, and training organisation based with people in Melbourne, Sydney, Singapore, and London. But we do and are lucky enough to work everywhere. Our focus is on translating and using the best evidence. This is almost the perfect conference for CEI to be at, given the focus on really high quality, very impressive evidence and evaluation work. We also work with people, because that's just part of the story, to figure out what this evidence base means, what it could mean for policymakers, what it could mean for program design. And then we are quite well known for some of our evaluation work, but in particular our implementation science work. When we work with governments, we work with service providers, we work with funders, anyone and everyone basically who is interested in partnering up with us to improve outcomes for those that are vulnerable in our community. And I will say I am originally from New Zealand, born in Queenstown, but my accent will tell you I wasn't there for very long. My parents are based in Auckland, so I'm very much looking forward to that bubble opening up again, let me tell you. So if we go to the next slide. So this is just trying to be funny about what probably isn't so funny, and that is the latest research shows that we really should be doing something with all this research that we have. Next slide. If we stop and think about the explosion of the What Works movement, including the evidence-based policing movement, and all the potential that research holds, that's often on websites, in academic journals, sometimes in reports, all the potential that research has to change lives, but we simply can't benefit from evidence if we don't receive it, right? So next slide. The area of implementation science emerged from a major concern about what is seen as what has actually been shown to be a very big gap between research and evidence that has been shown to improve outcomes in a variety of areas, including policing and juvenile justice, and the actual implementation of that in policy practice and in fact academia itself. There's some famous studies that have shown that in some areas, the gap between when something has been shown to work becomes business as usual, that it's just embedded in the way we do our work, that it isn't seen as new anymore, is 15 to 17 years. So that's a long time for us to wait to benefit from the things we know now work. And so implementation science emerged to try to address this about 30 years ago in the area of health, first figuring out how to get sort of the medicines and the various evidence-based approaches to people that it could benefit it. And it slowly started to move into areas of social welfare, juvenile justice, policing, and is really being acknowledged as not only helping us understand things more, but helping us improve our actual implementation of evidence. So if we go to the next slide. So just a quick, boring definition: implementation science is the study of how research and often other data, findings and evidence-based procedures are best adopted and integrated into routine programs, practice, or policy. So the definition in our work of effective implementation is that it goes from an innovation into almost business as usual. And implementation science has a lot to offer in terms of understanding what are the common barriers that are faced when trying to move something from an idea to implementation, what are the common facilitators, and what actual strategies can we embed to give us a better chance of achieving that effective implementation and not wasting that good science that's sitting there and not getting used and improved on. Next slide. So this is just an example in the last, that's really small, I'm sorry, the last 10-ish years, let's say, of the explosion of publications in the area of implementation. So the line that's kind of going flat there is we did a systematic search just looking for the term evidence-based across a variety of areas, not just like children and families, juvenile justice, etc. And you can see that that's kind of been going steady since 1998. The other dotted line above that, if that makes sense, is the amount of publications we found in a systematic search that use the terms evidence-based and implementation. And then the solid line is the publications that we found in the published literature that uses the term implementation or implementation science. And you can see it is really taking off. It's a growing area, which is terrific for all of us as the evidence-based policing movement really starts to generate more and more and more high quality evidence. We want to figure out how to get that used and tested and improved on, just like the previous speakers who are almost talking implementation science without them even knowing it. I'm going to try and pinpoint some strategies in some of the slides that they were using. Next slide. So the challenge with evidence and good research and good data is that it's only part of the story. So understanding what works, that is what you need to do to achieve an outcome, doesn't help you at all in figuring out how to effectively implement that service, that approach, that policy, that model. And a lot of the recent evidence reviews and the what works global movements that we all work with have really started to call out we need to move beyond testing. For example, hotspot policing is the one I know the best. Hotspot policing, we know what it is, we know what to do, we know how to make it work. Now, how do we figure out how to implement it and sustain it? So although we've got these great things demonstrating effectiveness, we really do need to start turning to how to translate and implement that better. And it isn't as well funded. And a lot of people do think implementation is easy. And I would say most of you at this conference, particularly those of you on the ground, know it's not. And even better, there's some things that I can share with you to help. Next slide. So this is a nice little article that I found in Police Quarterly. And the authors here are calling out for the research in the area of policing and other sort of crime and justice areas really need to start thinking about not only does the intervention work, but what was the intervention made up of? What were the components that needed to be done? How often? With what quality? And by who? And without starting to conduct some of our research thinking about how was it implemented and how is that related to outcomes, it's going to be very difficult to spread and scale interventions that work, because we're not too sure what was the active ingredients or the parts of it that worked. Were there some things we could have dropped that were unnecessary? So they do a really nice piece here just calling out we need to really look inside what we talk about as the black box of interventions to figure out if they work, what worked, for who, and then how can we replicate that and scale. Next slide. So implementation really matters. There are just so many studies and papers and points now really showing that without paying some special attention to implementation, we won't get the effect. I'll give you an example. It's unfortunate, people don't often like it, but there are a number and multiple studies now showing that training by itself, no matter how good it is important but insufficient to achieve effective implementation. There are often other strategies we need to use. And again, the speakers before me actually did a really good job showing the other strategies they used. We talked about co-creation, they talked about feedback, that probably enabled them to get better implementation, you'd hope, but it's not always a welcome story, especially when ministers want to get something out quite quickly. Next slide. The example also is, this is a bit of a powerful one I find in mental health. So there are over 500 known evidence-based interventions that have been identified in the area of mental health for young people. Yet many studies have gone and looked at what's actually being done in service as usual. This is mostly in the US, Canada, and some studies in Australia and the UK. And they can only evidence about 14% to 20% of what's being offered to young people as having any evidence base at all, and very little focus on how to make sure it's being effectively implemented. And that's in mental health. And in the current environment with COVID, we need to do better. We need to do better at closing that no-do gap, and we need to do better at making sure it's implemented sustainably. Next slide. And the great Mark Lipsey, I like to call him, who I was lucky enough to work with some time ago, and some of you may know this piece where he conducted what must have been one of the hardest big meta-analysis of studies around what works in juvenile justice programs. And this is an important quote for him that I'm going to read verbatim, just so what he found when he looked at all these studies together and looked at the cumulative effect of them all, he found that the quality with which the intervention was implemented was strongly related to recidivism effects as the type of program. So much so that a well-implemented intervention that was not as effective outperformed an intervention that had been shown to be very effective that wasn't implemented well. So that just has to make logical sense. You might have the really good 2 aspirin. You don't take them in the way that the instructions say. So the aspirin might work really well for the headache, but it doesn't matter because you didn't implement it well. So his work that he did in 2009 sort of stopped a number of us in our tracks a little bit. And we thought, if we focused a little bit more on implementing things well, even if their effectiveness was moderate compared to some things that have been shown to be very effective in some studies, maybe that's a better bet. Maybe we should be making evidence-based interventions available for everybody, and we focus our infrastructure, our money, our costs, and our research efforts on how to implement it well. Next slide. So implementation science recognizes that the what, so the intervention, the policy, practice, innovation, I know I'm using multiple terms for that, but it applies across a number of areas, really needs to figure out how to work with the system that it's going to be implemented in. So I call this the 3-egg diagram. It's developed by some colleagues in the US. The reason I like it is it just shows that you might have an intervention. So this might be in juvenile justice, again, another area I'm familiar with. It has components and things that people need to do, but we need to figure out how it fits with the setting it's going to be implemented in, whether that's an organization, whether that's a cluster of offices, whether it's a school, so you're sort of figuring out, you're not taking the intervention as is and sort of shoving it in there. Implementation science has been clear. We do need to do some adaptation safely, so we don't take the special sauce away, but also in particular, we need to do adaptation for culture. We need to do adaptation for climate. In Australia and New Zealand, unfortunately, and this might not be the case in policing, a lot of the more evidence-based interventions in a number of the areas we all work in have been studied outside our countries. And context really matters. It really, really matters. And you'll see also from the three-egg diagram, the authors there are arguing you not only need to figure out how to make it fit with the practice setting, you need to figure out how to make it fit. I'm going to cough. I'm sorry, that is definitely not COVID, even though I'm in Melbourne. I haven't been anywhere ever. Sorry, hay fever season. It also needs to fit with the broader context, the cultural context, the political context, the values and beliefs of the people that you're serving, but the values and beliefs of the people that are implementing it as well. It's a major hot topic in implementation science, but it's pretty clear we need to do some careful adaptation and help things fit for organization and context. Next slide. So I'm going to go race you through some hot topics in implementation science. This is just to really mess with your head a little bit, this complicated diagram. I'm just going to introduce it like this. One hot topic and common feature and contribution implementation science has made to the various fields we all work in is the development of implementation frameworks. Now, these are staged and phased, almost like implementation plans or blueprints. They've been developed by implementation scientists who have studied what happens in the implementation process and what are the things it looks like we have to do to achieve effective implementation. This is one called the EPIS framework. It's being used in over 700 both research projects and implementation science in action projects, that is applying the science to real life projects we want to do across a number of areas. People do find it a little bit intimidating when we come to it, but we're finding ways to make it a little bit simple. But what I want you to notice there is there's 4 phases. There's an exploration phase, preparation, implementation, and sustaining. And the EPIS framework argues that you need to not only figure out what's going on in the inner context of the organization to achieve implementation, but also outer. I'm going to show you an example of another framework. Go to the next slide. Here's another one we use at Centre for Evidence Implementation. By the way, we haven't developed a framework because there's enough in the published literature, over 80, in fact. We have a handful that we like to use flexibly in the work we do alongside the various systems that we work with. But the reason I wanted to put this one up is it shows you, this is another example, and this framework also has 4 phases, a preparation phase, early implementation, full and sustainment. And there are implementation strategies that we recommend you try and tackle in each of these phases. And I've got a few examples for you. But again, it's not a perfect science. There's lots of different frameworks that can be adapted, but what's consistent is you must sort of think about it in phases, even if you're running phases at the same time. And the early implementation one is the one we call pay now or pay later. So really try and do some good planning up front and then implement your plan, which is an obvious point, really, to anyone that's done any organizational change work. Next slide. This is also hopefully fills you with excitement and doesn't intimidate you. Within each of those phases, there are a variety of recommended implementation strategies you could implement. Now, training is an example of one, but sometimes so is coaching in the field. Other examples are funding, governance frameworks, forming implementation teams. There's a whole raft of them that when we're designing implementation plans with groups we're supporting, we do this in a collaborative manner to figure out which strategies we think might be the ones that will help us achieve effective implementation. So that's the how, right? How are we going to get this what implemented well? And these strategies can often try and handle people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors to give you a better chance of them taking on the new innovation. But it also gives you a chance to think about organizational processes and structures, culture, climate, and how ready is the system for this innovation anyway? And do we need to do something to increase readiness? Next slide. I'm sorry, that's so small. I just wanted to show this to you that there are some very smart scientists that have done a lot of work that we can benefit from, so we don't have to start from scratch. And this is an example of a systematic review that was done looking at the most common implementation strategies that have been tested to target professional behavior change. And this is in health and mental health settings, but I argue it would apply for all settings. There's one strategy in there that I think is super promising, and I wonder in the context that all of you work, this wouldn't be too far from what you'd be used to, and that is audit and feedback. Sounds a little bureaucratic, but it's been shown, particularly in hospital systems, where you're auditing whether or not a particular approach, say doctors washing their hands, has been implemented, how well and where are there problems with implementation, and then you provide that feedback and develop some strategies to overcome that problem with implementation. And hand washing is often goes up and down in terms of how well it's implemented, how effectively. Audited feedback has been shown in multiple studies all over the world, multiple countries, to be in and of itself quite an effective implementation strategy. So sometimes these plans can be simple, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of ones that are more complex. Next slide. This is for the evaluators and the researchers in the room. I just want to use this to demonstrate 2 points. This diagram here is showing us that we need a what, so that is your innovation, your program, your practice, but we equally need a how. What is your implementation plan? What strategies are you going to pair with your what to get it effectively implemented? And then we need to measure it. And measurement can be done outside of the context of evaluation. Just like any continuous improvement business arrangement, we should be collecting data and using it, being pragmatic about what we collect, not collecting too much, and using it as frequently as possible to track how we're going and how we can improve. And the circle in that figure there is just showing different ways implementation can be measured that people often forget. And sometimes it's as simple as, is this even acceptable to the people that need to implement it? Is it sustainable? Is it going to cost too much? And that's, so this is just a little bit of encouragement. And again, it goes back to the paper I had before around the black box of implementation, where we really want to start thinking about not only measuring outcomes and targets and KPIs, but a little bit of this implementation data to see how we're going or where we could improve. Next slide. I'm going to skip this. Next slide. If anyone wants to know what that is, it's about measurement, but I just am watching that clock and want to give you a chance for some questions. I'm happy to talk to anybody on the side. I think the slides will be made available. This readiness tool, one of the other implementation strategies that looks to be very promising across a number of settings when used well, is the idea of assessing how ready people and systems are before you move anything into an implementation phase. So it's thinking a little bit about the motivation of the people that you're working with and whether or not they think this new program practice policy is better than the thing they were doing before. And if they don't, they're unlikely to do the new thing. But also whether it's a priority for people. This readiness tools often look at how much capacity does the setting that it will be implemented have to be able to take on the innovation. And it also looks at how well do people understand what the innovation is? Do people know what this new program or app or assessment is? Do they know how to use it properly? If not, do we need to do a bit more training? If you assess readiness ahead of time, a lot of studies and in our experience show that it gives you a little bit of a chance to enhance the readiness of people and systems before you go in, which gives you a little bit better chance of achieving effective implementation. It's not meant to be a test, though. Sometimes it has backfired for us when we've used it in settings, but it's just an example of another little best bet in the implementation science area to help us implement things. Next slide. This is a fabulous study. One of the good things about implementation science is most of the papers are available online, open source. So they're not behind paywalls. You don't have to buy them. This study has an awful title, but they used, if you remember the EPIS framework that I showed earlier, the one with the circles and the colorful boxes, they used that framework as a way to design and guide an implementation study where they were taking some very evidence-based approaches for substance use and substance abuse with young people. So substance use treatment outcomes for for young people involved in community services. And they were able to use collectively, and this wasn't researchers, this was clinicians, police, a good multidisciplinary team co-design an implementation plan and an evaluation plan that they could slowly roll out to see if they could get these evidence-based approaches for substance abuse implemented sustainably. Next slide. And sorry, this probably isn't showing up very well on your screens, but here's an example of what they did. So you can see the phases are there. So an exploration phase, the preparation phase, remember that's the pay now, pay later phase, the actual implementation phase where rubber hits the road, you're trying to get everything in place in the sustaining phase. And just a little example of the different strategies they used at each phase that they planned together ahead of time and then implemented. So it's just, I wanted to show you a few live examples. Next slide. This one, you also use the EPIS framework to do a system-wide scale-up of this substance use services. Go to the next slide. And these are all open source if people want to look at them. That is shocking for you to see. What I wanted to demonstrate there is they took a very, what I would argue is a light touch behavioral health approach in the juvenile justice system. And then they made a plan again using those phases as to what implementation strategies they would implement. And they were actually trying to test which would work better. This works very well in live rapid improvement efforts in service delivery. There's no reason why in the work that we all do in the various systems, we can't sort of think really clearly about the implementation strategies we want to use and do rapid testing. We have a strategy we call how low can you go? What's the least amount of effort I can put in to get the effect? Because, we're not going to put all 70 implementation strategies. But there's really live examples where in thinking about implementation science and its use, it doesn't have to be locked up in research studies and evaluation. It is an active practice-based science. So it's very applicable to a lot of the work I've heard some of you share from the first day, whenever it was, and now. Next slide. And this article here, the authors do a very nice example. I wasn't too sure why they did this, but they refer to case of place approach, which when you read the article, they're talking about hotspot policing again. But they did a study trying to look at what were the barriers to implementing and scaling these approaches across a number of settings up in the US, and found that the culture and climate of the organization of the setting who were implementing it, had the largest effect or influence, on whether the hotspot policing approach was implemented entirely. And that sometimes we don't plan for, organizational culture, climate points. So that you would then argue, if you knew that ahead of time, that's where you would focus your implementation plan on addressing what was showing up in terms of barriers to implementing with culture and climate. And that's showing up in mental health studies and child protection studies all over the place. So it's something we really have to get better at. Next slide. Oh, that's the tiniest writing. I'm really making it quite hard on you. I'm very sorry. Here's some ways I just wanted to sum up what I had shared with you then, just to sort of try and bring it all together. Implementation occurs in phases and stages, no matter what. So those frameworks I talked about, the science has shown, even if you're trying to rush something, sometimes I have a colleague, I think she's online, who works with me at CI. Carla can tell you all about having to run 3 phases at once for some work she's doing with the Child and Family Services here in Victoria. It's not perfect, but at least it gives us a roadmap based on some science to help guide some of our decision making. It can require an assessment of needs up front. Implementation will depend on how ready individuals and organizations are for implementation. It really does tell us that we need to innovate and adapt. So people often talk about the concept of fidelity. I'm happy to take this offline, but a lot of efforts, implementation efforts, especially cross-culture or cross-country, have failed due to poor adaptation. Implementation science tells us we got to build our capacity to do this better. That implementation does happen in teams. It is a team sport, but we must learn new things and try new things It is certainly a science that is about keeping up with what the latest happening is, and learning and continuing to do and sharing what we're learning. And it does entail really adapting some of our infrastructure. It isn't just implementation doesn't equal training by itself. It might have an impact on the data we collect. It might have an impact on how we run our teams. It might have an impact on the sort of pre-training we do. We need to think more holistically to really benefit from some of the science that we've got. And as I've said a number of times to people that must get boring for them, without data, it's very difficult to do good implementation work because we just really don't know what's happening. So it really does require pragmatically selecting what's the least amount of data I need to understand. Am I reaching the people I thought I would reach? Am I implementing in a way that I thought, or I should say and are we getting the outcomes that we thought? And just continually monitoring that to see if we can superpower our implementation efforts. Next slide. This is a shameless ad. We wrote a book last year. It's an edited book, so it's not all from me and my co-authors, but it's trying to describe where is implementation science going now in its third decade of contributing to the various fields that we work in. And the authors in it are far better than I was as an editor, but it's got some really interesting stuff, particularly if any of this piqued your interest. It's in the Southern Hemisphere. There's not many places to train in this area yet, so we're trying to kind of create lots of ways people can develop and learn. Next slide. And that's me thanking you for your attention.
Robyn, I'm going to thank you for the breadth of analysis and depth of analysis and research that you've done. Thank you very much. We've got lots of comments coming through, and we did promise people time for questions, so I'm going to put them to you now if that's okay. We've got one that has come through.
I'm ready.
Good stuff. Okay, here we go. So testing what has been tested is so important. Implementation really is everything. But how do we create a culture of learning through testing that embraces failure as a learning opportunity?
Yeah, what a great question. There's so many different people that would have a lot more learning on how to do that. In my experience with all of the systems that I've supported to try and use implementation science to implement better, I'll go back to my data point. Data kind of, even if it's not very good data, like it doesn't have to be perfect, data tells a good story. And in some work I've done for a long time, I would table empty sheets because no one was collecting any data. And so I was using that as what are we doing wrong here that we can't do this? That's an example of failure. But also data allows you to course correct. So I think if we as leaders or as emerging leaders accept that change and making different decisions based on data and feedback from the people that we are here to serve is just normal. And it's not failure, and it's not getting in trouble, and it's not, it's learning, and it's trying to do better. And I've been totally unsuccessful doing it without data because people really get quite passionate about, well, no, we've said we were going to do this. A gentle, collaborative, and supportive use of data has allowed us to help, not all the time, but help certain systems make different decisions. And even there's a whole hot topic in implementation science and health about de-implementing. Now, in the areas that we work in, juvenile justice areas, some of you do work in, some policing, some child protection. I've never seen de-implementation. Maybe our policing colleagues here have, but we're getting there. I think if we can normalize data and normalize course correction, but it takes leaders to make that a safe thing to do.
Thank you. And the next question is also, I think, a little aligned as well. The question is, given the low uptake mentioned, more than 500 interventions, I think it was, how much is our communication with decision leaders part of the problem? Is it that although evidence exists to support an intervention, it simply isn't relayed effectively to decision leaders?
There is so much we. Yes, they're hidden in journals and clearinghouses and places that are hard to understand and hard to translate. So the accessibility. Sometimes the evidence-based movements are a little slow for people that need to make decisions. We take a little long, so they sort of pivot to something else. In the example I use for mental health, there are over 500 interventions that the authors identified, but when you look at the actual practices that are in those interventions, they're all quite similar. So it's this kind of, by packaging up evidence and trying to give it names and say we should be implementing this here and this there, we've sort of caused more of a problem for ourselves, I think, because how do decision makers know which one's better than the other? Unless we are really clear. And in particular in New Zealand and Australia, I think it's even more important because most of the studies that show that something has evidence-based would have been done outside our countries in different settings. And so we are trying to contribute by translating that evidence-based much clearer for all stakeholders in our system, for trying to make it a moral obligation to use the best of what we can when we're designing programs in practice, and pay special attention to context. So we have a long way to go. If you think about a decision maker trying to go through all those 500 interventions and figure out which one to do, I mean, it'd be near impossible. So they'll go for the latest. I think we have some innovation locally that could use a little bit more investment and some good evaluation to show that probably it also works in the way it's been designed and implemented. We just haven't given it enough implementation infrastructure. So it's just, there's so many reasons why. But conferences like this, I have just been so impressed with the evidence-based policing. I mean, it's just, this association is streets ahead of some of the areas that we work with. It's really, so I feel quite hopeful that even this conference exists.